In the book of Leviticus, God gave Israel 7 annual feasts. Most Christians know about Passover. Some know about Pentecost. Almost nobody has been taught all 7, what each one means, when each one was observed, and what each one was pointing toward. And here is what changes everything. Jesus fulfilled 4 of those 7 feasts in exact chronological sequence on the exact feast days themselves in a single year. He died on Passover. He was in the tomb during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He rose on the Feast of Firstfruits, and the Holy Spirit was poured out on Pentecost, the 4th feast, 50 days later. 4 feasts, 4 fulfillments, on the exact calendar days, in the exact order. But here is what most Christians have never been told. 3 feasts remain. They have not yet been fulfilled. And the 3 fall feasts that Israel has been observing for 3,000 years, Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles, describe in precise sequence what is still coming. The feasts of Israel are not ancient Jewish tradition that became irrelevant when Jesus arrived. They are a prophetic calendar that God built around Jesus, before Jesus was born. And the calendar is still running. 7 feasts, 4 fulfilled, 3 remaining. And the 3 still coming are the ones most Christians have never studied. Let's go in order. Before we go feast by feast, we need to understand 3 things about what these feasts actually are. First, they are not Israel's feasts. This is the first thing most people miss, and it is right there in the text. Leviticus 23:2 does not say, "These are the feasts of Israel." It says, "These are the appointed feasts of the Lord." They are God's feasts. God is the one who established them, God is the one who set their dates, and God is the one who loaded them with prophetic content that would take centuries to fully understand. Second, they are appointments on a divine calendar. The Hebrew word translated as feasts is the word moed, which means appointed times, fixed meetings, scheduled encounters. The feasts were not celebrations in the sense of parties. They were appointments, times when God had scheduled something to happen between himself and his people. And when you look at what actually happened on those dates, the precision of the scheduling is one of the most extraordinary things in the Bible. Third, they fall into 2 groups separated by several months. The spring feasts, Passover, Unleavened Bread, Firstfruits, and Pentecost, all occur in the spring. The fall feasts, Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles, all occur in the fall. The spring feasts were fulfilled in Jesus' first coming. The fall feasts are pointing toward his second. We are going to go through all 7 feasts in the order they appear on the biblical calendar. We are going to see what each feast commanded, what it symbolized, how it was observed, and then we are going to see exactly how each spring feast was fulfilled and what each fall feast is still pointing toward. 7 feasts, 2 groups, 1 calendar. Let's go in order. Nisan 14. The death of the Lamb Passover is the oldest feast in Israel's calendar. It was instituted the night God delivered Israel from Egypt, the night the angel of death passed over every home, marked with the blood of a lamb. Every year on the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar, Israel would sacrifice a Passover lamb at twilight. The lamb had to be without blemish. Its bones could not be broken, and its blood was the sign that brought protection. Here is what most people miss about Passover. The specifications for the Passover lamb were not just practical instructions for a historical ceremony, they were a portrait of someone who had not yet arrived. Lamb without blemish, no sin. Blood shed for protection, atonement. Bones not broken. John 19:36. Notes specifically that when the soldiers came to break Jesus' legs at the crucifixion and found he was already dead, they did not break them. He fulfilled the Passover requirement to the biological detail. And the timing. Jesus was crucified on the 14th of Nisan, Passover, the exact day that Israel had been sacrificing lambs for 1,500 years. Not approximately, not symbolically. On the feast day itself, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Not Christ is like a Passover lamb. Christ is our Passover lamb, the reality to which every Passover lamb for 15 centuries was a shadow. The first feast was fulfilled on its own calendar date by the death of the one the feast always pointed toward, Nisan 15 to 21. The body without corruption. The Feast of Unleavened Bread began the day after Passover and lasted 7 days. During those 7 days, Israel removed all leaven, all yeast, from their homes. They ate only flat, unleavened bread, no corruption, no puffing up, nothing that was allowed to decay and ferment. Leaven in the Bible consistently represents corruption, sin, and the tendency of a small wrong to spread until it affects everything. Paul uses this exact language in 1 Corinthians 5. Purge out the old leaven. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Here is what most people miss about unleavened bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread spans the exact period that Jesus was in the tomb. He died on Passover, Nisan 14. The Feast of Unleavened Bread began Nisan 15. He rose on Nisan 17, the Feast of Firstfruits. The days his body lay in the tomb were precisely the days of the feast that celebrated the absence of corruption. Peter wrote in Acts 2:27, quoting Psalm 16, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption." The body in the tomb did not corrupt. The unleavened body, the one without the leaven of sin, lay in the earth for the exact duration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The feast was fulfilled in the tomb, the day after the Sabbath of Passover week, the first of the resurrection, harvest. The Feast of Firstfruits was celebrated on the day after the Sabbath of Passover week. The priest would wave the first sheaf of the barley harvest before God, the firstfruits, the first of what the full harvest would be. It was a declaration, more is coming. This is the first, the rest will follow. Paul calls Jesus the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep, not as a metaphor, as a feast fulfillment. Jesus rose from the dead on the exact day of the Feast of Firstfruits, the day after the Sabbath of Passover week, Sunday morning. Here is what most people miss about this. The resurrection did not happen on a randomly chosen Sunday. It happened on the one day out of the entire year that the biblical calendar had designated for celebrating the first of the resurrection harvest. The priest was waving the first sheaf in the temple at the same moment the tomb was opening outside the city. The First Fruits Feast says this is the first. The rest of the harvest will follow. Paul makes this connection explicit, as in, Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. Christ the firstfruits, then, at his coming, those who belong to him. The third feast was fulfilled in the resurrection, on its own calendar date, 50 days after first fruits. Noiti, the harvest begins. 50 days after first fruits, the word Pentecost simply means 50th, Israel observed the Feast of Weeks, also called Pentecost. It was the feast of the wheat harvest, where firstfruits celebrated the first sheaf. Pentecost celebrated the harvest that had now arrived in full. 2 loaves of leavened bread were waved before God, representing all the people, with their leaven, their imperfection, being brought into God's presence. Here's what most people miss about Pentecost. The church celebrates Pentecost as the birthday of the church, the day the Holy Spirit was poured out in Acts 2, and that is correct. But most Christians do not know that this happened on the feast day. The disciples were gathered in Jerusalem because it was Pentecost, the required pilgrimage feast. The crowds in Acts 2 who heard Peter's sermon were there because of the feast. And the harvest imagery of the feast was fulfilled in the most literal way possible. The Feast of Pentecost celebrated the wheat harvest. Acts 2 records that 3,000 people were added to the church in a single day. The first great harvest of believers gathered on the exact feast day that the biblical calendar had designated for celebrating the harvest. 2 leavened loaves, Jew and Gentile imperfect people now brought together into God's presence through the Spirit. The harvest feast fulfilled in a harvest of souls. 4 feasts, 4 fulfillments, in exact sequence, on exact calendar dates, in a single year. Between the spring and fall feasts, the church age. Between the spring feasts and the fall feasts, there is a gap of several months on the biblical calendar. No feasts. A long summer interval. Here is what most people miss about the gap. The gap between the spring feasts and the fall feasts corresponds to the church age, the long period between Jesus' first coming and his second. We are in the summer of God's calendar. The spring harvest is complete. The fall harvest has not yet begun. And everything the fall feasts describe is still ahead. Tishri 1. The announcement that something is coming. The Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah in the Jewish calendar, was observed on the first day of the 7th month. The command was simple: blow the trumpets, loud, sustained, unmistakable blasts of the shofar. No specific reason is given in Leviticus for the blowing. Just blow them. Make an announcement. Something important is approaching. The Feast of Trumpets was a warning, a preparation, a call to attention before the most solemn day on the entire calendar, the Day of Atonement, which would arrive 10 days later. Here is what most people miss about the Feast of Trumpets. The New Testament uses trumpet language almost exclusively for one event. 1 Corinthians 15:52. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable. 1 Thessalonians 4:16. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. Matthew 24:31. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds. The trumpet in every second coming passage in the New Testament is the same language as the Feast of Trumpets, the announcement, the gathering call, the signal that something of ultimate importance is arriving. The 5th feast points to the announcement of the second coming, the call that will gather God's people from every corner of the earth. Tishri 10, the most solemn day on God's calendar. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is the most solemn day in the entire biblical calendar. It is the one day per year when the high priest entered the most holy place of the tabernacle and later the temple, the inner sanctuary where God's presence dwelled, to make atonement for the sins of the entire nation. The ritual was elaborate. 2 goats were selected. 1 was sacrificed. Its blood carried into the most holy place and sprinkled on the mercy seat. The other, the scapegoat, had the sins of the nation symbolically transferred onto it, and it was sent into the wilderness, carrying the sins away. Here is what most people miss about the Day of Atonement. It is the one feast that directly connects to the sanctuary and to judgment. The high priest entered the most holy place on this one day to complete the final work of atonement. The records were examined. The sins of Israel were addressed before God's throne. The community stood in a posture of examination, fasting, confessing, waiting for the high priest to emerge from the sanctuary and declare that the atonement was complete. The book of Hebrews uses the Day of Atonement as its primary framework for understanding what Jesus is doing right now. Hebrews 8:1. We have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord. not by a mere human being. Hebrews 9. The high priest enters the most holy place once a year with blood, but Christ entered once for all with his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. Jesus is the high priest. The heavenly sanctuary is real. The Day of Atonement's work is what his priestly ministry in heaven represents, the final resolution of the sin question before he returns. And the Day of Atonement feast lands 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets, 10 days after the announcement of his coming. The solemn work of atonement and judgment follows the trumpet announcement. The pattern of the fall feasts is the sequence of the second coming, Tishri 15-21. God dwelling with his people. The Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, was the most joyful feast in the entire calendar. For 7 days, Israel lived in temporary shelters, or booths, constructed from branches and leaves. They were commemorating the 40 years when Israel lived in temporary dwellings in the wilderness, when God tabernacled with them in the tent of meeting. The feast was the celebration of God's presence among his people. The dwelling, the closeness, the community of God and his people sharing the same space. And the feast looks forward. Revelation 21:3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." The word for dwelling place in Revelation 21 is the same root as tabernacle, skene in Greek. God tabernacling with his people. The Feast of Tabernacles, the feast of God dwelling with his people, finds its ultimate fulfillment in the new creation, when the barrier between God and his people is removed permanently. The seventh feast is not pointing to a temporary shelter in a campground. It is pointing to eternity, to the moment when the thing the feast always celebrated in symbol becomes the permanent reality. God with his people forever. 7 days of tabernacles, eternity of God's dwelling presence. The final feast points to the final answer. Here is the pattern most people never see. God did not design the feasts as historical commemorations for Israel to perform and then set aside when the New Testament arrived. He designed the feasts as a prophetic calendar, a sequence of 7 appointments that would be fulfilled by one person in 2 phases across the entire span of human history. 4 feasts fulfilled at the first coming. The Passover lamb was sacrificed. Jesus died. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was observed. Jesus lay in the tomb without corruption. The Feast of Firstfruits was celebrated. Jesus rose, the first of the resurrection harvest. Pentecost arrived. The Spirit came. The harvest of souls began. 4 appointments, 4 fulfillments, on the exact calendar dates, in the exact order God prescribed in Leviticus, written 15 centuries before the fulfillments occurred. 3 feasts still ahead. The Feast of Trumpets, the announcement, the gathering call, the last trumpet, the unmistakable signal that the one who fulfills the final feasts is arriving. The Day of Atonement, the final resolution of the atonement question. The high priest completing his work in the heavenly sanctuary. The judgment before the return. The Feast of Tabernacles, God dwelling with his people permanently. No more temple. No more feasts needed. The reality that the feasts were always pointing toward Emmanuel, God with us, made eternal and unending. Here's what most people miss about this complete picture. The feasts are not divided between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They span both. 4 fulfilled in the New, 3 pointing beyond it. The feasts of Israel are not a Jewish relic replaced by Christian holidays. They are the prophetic skeleton of the entire biblical story. The spring feasts should give you the most unshakable confidence in the New Testament record of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. He did not fulfill 4 ancient feasts approximately or symbolically. He fulfilled them on the right days, in the right order, with the right details. details that were written into Israel's worship calendar 15 centuries before he arrived. That kind of precision does not happen by chance. It happens by design. And if God was that precise about the first 4 feasts, then what he has said about the last 3 deserves every ounce of your attention and expectation. The fall feasts have not been fulfilled yet. But God's prophetic calendar has a 100% fulfillment rate so far. The trumpet will sound. The Day of Atonement's final work will be complete, and God will tabernacle permanently, eternally, with his people. 7 feasts, 1 calendar, 1 God, 1 story, and we are living in the gap between Feast 4 and Feast 5, waiting for the trumpet that has been on the calendar since Leviticus. If this video changed how you see the feasts of Israel, if you'll never read about Passover or Pentecost or Yom Kippur the same way again, share this with someone in your church or Bible study. This is the kind of biblical framework that changes how you read Leviticus, how you understand the Gospels, and how you hold the second coming with the confidence the calendar deserves. We've already gone deep on every covenant God made, every letter Paul wrote, every tribe of Israel, why Isaiah's 66 chapters unlock the entire Bible, and the hidden pattern behind every 40 in the Bible. Every video connects, every thread runs somewhere. 7 feasts, 4 fulfilled, 3 coming. And the God who was this precise about the first 4 has not changed his calendar. Subscribe, and we'll keep going deeper.